Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about religion. More accurately, I would like to talk to you about how our culture and our society misunderstands the concept of religion. We often present various things as the opposite of religion, and often equate the things that we see as the opposite of religion together. For example, thanks to the well-known popular idea that science and religion are at odds with each other and are in an active state of warfare, we will often conceptualize science as the opposite of religion. We will also characterize atheism as the opposite of religion. And of course, secularism is the opposite of religion. Though perplexingly, one can adhere to secularism whilst being religious, just as one can be religious and be a scientist. There are various ways of conceptualizing how this is possible, ranging from the idea that in order to be religious and scientific, one must compartmentalize and never subject one's religious thoughts to scientific scrutiny, dividing one's mind in how one approaches the world scientifically, but one's religion separately, to the idea of an accommodationist view of some sort. But in reality, I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what religion is and what these other things are in our society. For example, even though it's well known that science and religion are actively opposed to each other and are engaged in a sort of constant struggle, a warfare, people are now becoming more and more aware that this narrative is more mythology than actuality. The idea that science and religion are at odds with each other was developed in the late 19th century by two men, Draper and White, and the theory has been largely rejected by historians and scientists alike. But it is still part of our cultural fabric that this is so. But it's not. Although we still, when abandoning the idea of constant warfare between science and religion, acknowledge that science and religion are two separate things. And I don't really think this is a helpful way of understanding the world. And I certainly don't think it's helpful to understand atheism as the opposite of religion, such as when we ask what religion someone follows and they say, he's not religious, he's an atheist. And keep in mind, I've spoken to a lot of militant atheists who think that the next words out of my mouth are, atheism is a religion! And they'll mock me because they know that religious people will often call atheism a religion, and they know that they can just respond by pointing out that the definition of atheism is a lack of belief in a God and how that's not a religion. And I just don't care anymore. I'm quite used to atheists being dishonest psychopaths who never actually address the point that's being made. But keep in mind, even if I said atheism is a religion, you cannot prove me wrong just by telling me that I'm wrong, that atheism is not a religion. Atheism is a lack of belief in a God. Atheism is a religion, like not collecting stamps is a hobby. Because if I did say atheism is a religion, I would also give you a reason why I think atheism is a religion, and you have to address those reasons rather than just declare me wrong and talk about a definition of the word atheism. Especially since the definition of the word atheism as a lack of belief in a God only goes back to about 1974 and was invented by Anthony Flew in The Presumption of Atheism. And I say that having watched Rationality Rules explain how previous atheists actually defined atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and how atheists have these quotes from historical atheists that prove prove that that's how they understood it. Quotes from Bertrand Russell, from Robert Ingersoll, and from Charles Bradlaugh. For example, Charles Bradlaugh said he doesn't even know what the word God means. That proves that he had no concept of a God. That proves he understood atheism to be a lack of belief in a God. That's the obvious, plain reading of the text, and anyone who disagrees is using mental gymnastics. Of course, the truth is that Charles Bradlaugh clearly stated in the same essay that God does not exist. When Bradlaugh said he didn't know what is meant by the word God, he was actually making the argument that the concept of God is incoherent and ill-defined, and was using that as an argument that God is a phantasm of the imagination. He was not saying he lacked belief in a God personally, or that his atheism was a lack of belief in a God. And the same thing is true of the other quotes you'll see from Ingersoll or Russell. None of them actually say atheism is a lack of belief in a God. Instead, the atheist who has for years been told that atheism is a lack of belief in a God is reading that into the quotes. And it becomes rather like other quotes that they use historically to prove a point that's not really true. For example, quoting America's founding fathers to say that they were at best deists and that they rejected Christianity and rejected religion. They don't even bother checking if the quotes are real or not. And even when they are, sometimes they have the little ... in them, which shows that they've cut pieces out. And they're not really trying to understand what the quote is saying. They're not reading the broader context. They simply issue the quote and assume that a modern atheist who is primed to believe something, reading those quotes, is understanding it and is giving us the plain reading of the text, just like they do with the Bible. These are the same atheists who don't realize that the whole plain reading of the text when it comes to the Bible bit comes from Robert Ingersoll, because they probably got it from Matt Dillahunty or Aaron Raw or someone. None of it is original. They all just keep quoting the old atheist literature, which is actually sacred scripture and forms dogma for their own form of religion. But therein lies the point. I see the modern atheist movement as a religious movement. I do not see a mere lack of belief in a God as a religion. But atheism is not a mere lack of belief in a God. Atheism is a belief that gods do not exist. However, having said that, knowing full well atheists will be angry at me and say I'm redefining the word atheism. Keep in mind, every dictionary defined atheism as a belief there is no God until recently, and only changed it because atheists bullied them to. And you can look at the etymology online. And even the stupid routine where you go through it by saying, "You're confused. Let me explain. A means without. Theism means belief in a God. You put those together and you get without belief in a God, or lack of belief in a God. There. I hope that helps." Being very condescending and arrogant. That doesn't mean anything, because for one thing, the affix a in front of a word doesn't mean without or lack of. If it did, then atypical would mean lack of typical, and it doesn't. Atypical means not typical. It does not mean lack of typical. And when you actually look at the word atheism, it has always been a positive position that God does not exist. And even the modern atheists who tried pulling that, well, words change meaning excuse. Keep in mind that the same atheists telling us that atheism is just a lack of belief in a God also call people delusional for believing in God. In order to be delusional, one has to hold a false belief even after one has been shown evidence that the belief is false. In other words, in order for God to be a delusion, you have to have evidence that God does not exist. That is simply a fact. If I am delusional for believing in God, that means that I have been shown evidence that God does not exist that I am actively rejecting. And we all know that That's not true of theists. Theists are not being shown evidence by atheists that God doesn't exist, that they are actively rejecting and refusing to believe. Atheists show no evidence whatsoever and insist that they merely lack belief in a God. Therefore, they're making no claims and have no burden of proof, based solely on the definition of the word atheism. And this is rather important because it strikes at the very heart of the problem that I'm highlighting in this video. You see, both secularism and atheism are defined in such a way as to make it difficult, if not impossible, to criticize them. In a debate between an atheist and a theist on whether or not God exists, the theist would have the sole burden of proof because the theist is the only one making a claim, allowing the atheist to attack everything the theist is saying, while at the same time being viewed as someone who's not actually claiming anything. The atheist isn't biased. The atheist is simply listening to what the theist says and analyzing it and explaining why the theist argument is based on logical fallacies and why it's not convincing. And they can just sit there like Matt Dillahunty and say, I am not convinced. But we all know that the atheist isn't this unbiased neutral party who merely lacks belief. If they were, they wouldn't be engaged in debate in the first place. The atheist is there to shoot down arguments for God's existence, because the atheist wants us to believe that God does not exist. They are simply not being honest about that. And it creates this artificial sense of higher validity to the atheist position than it deserves. Because when you look at a debate between a theist and an atheist, and the theist accepts that the atheist merely lacks belief and doesn't have the burden of proof, then the audience is treated to a spectacle in which even if the theist successfully counters every single argument the atheist makes, at the end of the day, the theist looks weaker than the atheist simply because the atheist was able to find faults with the theist's beliefs, whilst the theist found no fault with the atheist. This makes the atheist position look stronger because it has not been criticized. You could find nothing to criticize it on. If you think logically about it, it wouldn't make any sense to make it look weaker, because if atheism truly were a great big nothing burger, if the atheist really did just lack belief, then it would make sense that there would be nothing there to criticize. But debates work on an emotional level for most people, and most people don't seem to self-reflect on that, especially subconsciously. Subconsciously, you see an atheist who is not being criticized. Of course, those days are past. I'm fairly certain that even though most people still accept that atheism is indeed defined as a lack of belief in a God, people are more willing to challenge certain things the atheists say. But I say that we should challenge even that. Because if atheists are going to call people delusional for believing in a magical sky fairy, and talk about how people are mentally ill for believing in God, and refer to God as their imaginary friend, then the atheist has to admit that they are indeed making a claim and that they have the burden of proof. And the same problem exists for secularism. Our society defines secularism as a belief in the separation of religion from government and a neutrality toward religion and social policy, which may sound nice to people, but in practice, secularism is not neutrality toward religion and religious beliefs. Rather, when we have a secular government, we have to understand what is and is not secular and what is and is not religious. And we never limit it to just believing a God exists. Take, for example, abortion. The pro-life side is seen as being driven by religion, which is one argument that secularists use to say that it has no place in society, that a secular society must support a woman's fundamental right to bodily autonomy and a fundamental right to choose her own reproductive path in life and to control her own reproductive health. And that is how they talk. They talk about abortion as being about a woman's bodily autonomy. They talk about it as being about a woman's right to make choices about her own health care. And they reframe the entire debate as being solely about whether a woman should have a right to bodily autonomy or not, with people who are pro-life being opposed to a woman's bodily autonomy. That, and it is understood that people are pro-life because of religion. Religion tells you that life begins at conception. Religion is, of course, not scientific. Science doesn't say that. Science, I guess, says that we begin our life at birth. But science and reason, not religion, should run our secular state. So the pro-choice position, the position that a woman's bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom should be protected, is the secular position, as opposed to being the religious, as opposed to pro-life, which is the religious position. And I think you understand the problem that I have brought up. Unless, of course, you are a bigoted atheist psychopath or an ardent secular leftist. The problem with this is that you are using word games. People are pro-life because they believe life begins at conception. And they do not believe life begins at conception simply because a silly old book written by Bronze Age goat herders said so. They believe it because they have been convinced of this position. And this is a valid position that should be considered. The reason abortion is opposed is because it is the taking of an innocent human life. And talking about God being the world's biggest abortionist because of miscarriages and saying that if we make abortion illegal, women will go to prison for miscarriage, none of that was true historically. Women were not imprisoned for miscarriages historically. And calling God an abortionist because of a miscarriage is absolutely absurd and misses the entire point of what God is even supposed to be, because they're too busy making fun of Sky Daddy to understand that people do not worship a giant invisible man in the sky. Too many atheists actually believe that gods are by definition anthropomorphic when they're not. And it really doesn't matter, since one could actually be an atheist, even according to their own logic, where atheism is just a lack of belief in a god, and still oppose abortion on the same grounds. Talking about God being the world's greatest abortionist doesn't address why humans should have a right to kill babies, which is the actual point behind the pro-life movement. The truth of the matter is, secularism is not neutrality toward religion. No secularist in the world says that it is. Well, correction. They all say that it is, but they immediately contradict themselves. Because we endlessly hear about them talking about secular values, the values that a secular society must hold. And you have people like Phil Zuckerman talking about secular values voters, as if secular, not religious people will share the same perspective on the world. A perspective on the world that cannot be justified by a mere lack of belief in a God and lack of a religion. The reality is, our culture understands secularism to be a belief system that tells us how the world works, how we are supposed to live within this world, what values we hold, and that answers the ultimate questions of morality and existence. In other words, secularism is a religion. Defining secularism as the opposite of religion does not make it not religion in reality. It simply makes it dishonest. And you know that it's dishonest because secularists will talk about secular values coming into conflict with religious values. Well, if secularism has values, and if those values can conflict with someone else's religious values, then secularism is not neutral on those positions. What's more, one argument they make for secularism is that if we allow religion to take over society, which religion would it be? There are so many religions. Even look at Christianity. Even if we just choose Christianity to be the state religion, there are 42,000 denominations. Christianity isn't even a single religion, it's Christianities, plural. Which Christian denomination would be true? Which Christian tradition? They all disagree. And they actually use this as an argument for why society would be better off secular. At the very least, why our government should be secular and not religious. Because of all the conflict religion causes. But secularism causes conflict. The very fact that you have secular values that can conflict with someone else's religious values means that secularism is causing conflict. Unless you want to pretend that if there is conflict between secular values and religious values, religion is solely to blame. That if only the religious people would give up their values and throw them to the wayside to embrace secular values, we wouldn't have this conflict. And secularists do convince themselves of this, that if there is conflict between someone's religious values and the secular values they're seeking to run society on, and that person refuses to give up his religious values in order to comply with the secular values, and there is an actual conflict that results in that, the fault is religion, and it proves how bad and dangerous religion is and how we'd be better off without religion. After all, religion is causing the conflict. Religion is solely responsible for causing the conflict. It isn't a conflict between two values that people oppose on one side or the other. No. It's a conflict between a religious nutter who won't let go of his bizarre superstitions and embrace reason. And that's precisely the problem. Secular values are not automatically rational just because secular people call them rational. And a conflict between secular values and religious values is no different than a conflict between one religious group's values and another religious group's values. The only difference is that we play pretend that the secular values are not religious and are therefore not the same when they are. Conflict does not really occur because of religion. Conflict occurs because of disagreement. And this can be a disagreement at a most basic level, such as, we both live in a desert, but you guys have an oasis that has water, and my group wants that oasis with water. We're disagreeing on who should have the oasis with water. That's what causes conflict. Because if I agreed that my group should die of thirst, and everyone in my group agrees that we should die of thirst instead of taking the oasis by force, then there is no conflict. And the same thing happens with religion. There isn't this magical force called religion that causes people to hate and kill each other. People get into conflicts because of fundamental disagreements about things that they deeply care about and hold to be true. Whether actually holding them to be true, truly believing them, or ideologically believing in them because you think you get something out of it. It doesn't really matter. Humans are complex that way. But if you have a conflict between a Christian group and a Hindu group over values, or between a Christian group and a Muslim group, or a Christian group and a Jewish group, there really is no fundamental difference than if it's a Christian group and a secular group getting into an argument. What's more, it's been 25 or so years since the new atheism revived 19th century atheism. And guess what? The same thing happened as what happened with 19th century atheism. Infighting and disagreement caused the free thought movement to break apart back then. And then it was imposed by force with communism, and communism started killing people for disagreement, even if they were also atheists with no religion. China and the Soviet Union disagreed with each other. And as much as modern atheists say that communism had nothing to do with atheism, these were and still are fundamentally atheist states. Vietnam, China, Laos, they're all officially state atheists. The Soviet Union was a state atheist nation. They were atheist states, and they were secular states. And they didn't get along with each other. And in the modern world, the secular movement's falling apart precisely because secularists can't get along with each other. They argue over values now just as much as religious people do. Which is ironic because the divine prophet Christopher Hitchens Most Holy, who did hitch-slap many religious delusional idiots and who proved his supremacy and reason, actually said that the main difference between religious people and atheists when it comes to social and political decisions is that religion makes you unable to engage in any political or social discourse. Because if you have two atheists who are not religious and they have deep fundamental disagreement on something, they can still sit at a table and debate the issue in a calm, civilized fashion and perhaps change each other's minds or reach a compromise because they understand that human reason alone is what's guiding them. They understand that they can be mistaken. They are willing to work with others to make a society better. But with religious people, they think that every issue is a cosmic issue under divine sanction, and that the creator of the universe has told them personally what is and is not true, and every single issue is a sacred one, and they cannot be moved on any issue. They become intractable. No matter how minor or petty, they are intractable because they will not disobey their fictional God that they worship. Thus, why religion poisons everything. Because if you have religion involved in a discussion, religious people will not change their mind no matter how much facts or evidence you have that they're wrong, and will not compromise because they think they're right just because their sky daddy said so. Whereas atheists were more rational and are the adults in the room willing to work it out. Well, they're not. Atheists are not the adults in the room. All you have to do is read Only Sky or Hamet Mehta's Friendly Atheist blog. I remember last week, I don't know if the article came out last week, but I remember reading it last week, that Hamet Mehta was upset because his fellow atheists, who are part of several secularist organizations just like him, the American Humanist Association or British Humanist Association in case of Dawkins, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Center for Inquiry, and other groups like that. Atheists that he once respected wrote a book that's called The War on Science. But this book wasn't a book that exposed how religious people are a threat to science or how the Trump administration with its religious allies are destroying science. It focused on trans rights and other popular progressive talking points. And it's written by brilliant atheists like Lawrence Krauss, or Richard Dawkins, or Steven Pinker, or Peter Boghossian. Mehta was distraught that his fellow atheists would be on the wrong side of history and would take these bigoted views, and he could no longer stand with them. Just a few years ago, they were the United Front Against Religious Irrationality, and they would quote Hitchens telling us that atheists, no matter how deeply entrenched their disagreements are, would talk to each other. And now look at them. They're divided. And they're divided just as deeply and just as bitterly as any religious person would be when disagreeing with another religious person. They are divided just as much as Luther was with Zwingli, when Zwingli proposed that communion was a purely symbolic act, and that the bread and wine remain bread and wine, and that it is nothing but a remembrance of what Christ did for us. Luther slammed his hand down, and Luther quoting the Gospels, such as Matthew 26:26, or Mark 14:22, or Luke 22:19. And Luther wrote on the table and slammed his hand down and said, "This is my body." Luther refused to accept Zwingli's position that communion was purely symbolic. To Luther, communion truly did become the actual body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And while Luther himself disagreed with the Catholic position of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine truly indeed become the body and blood of Christ, he still thought that at consecration they carried in spiritual essence the body and blood of Christ. That in some way they were transformed by this, and that you could be transformed by taking the communion, whereas Zwingli rejected this, and they became bitterly divided, and the chances of a united Protestant church collapsed. We are supposed to see that, and other examples in history, as proof that religion causes division and religion makes people's views intractable, unlike how atheists are. And yet, atheists are standing divided now. How can they not be? Atheists are not less prone to thinking their position is the one truth and everyone else is wrong. It doesn't matter that they don't think that their views have divine sanction. And as for religious people, and I'm using the term as they would use it, the idea that they think that every single position they hold is the will of an almighty God, and they cannot compromise or change on anything because every single position they have is ordained by God on high and may not be challenged. Hitchens was simply lying about that. People who believe in God do not believe that every political position they hold has divine sanction. That is simply a lie. It was a caricature. But therein lies the point. There really is no difference between modern secularist thinking and a religion, right down to dogmatism and what we regrettably call fundamentalism. And I hate using that word because it's lost all meaning, like the word fascist. But there we are. The simple reality is, in a sense, the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy of the Holy Religion of Atheism was right. In our culture, we are in a war. But the war is a war of ideas. However, the ardent secularists are using stealth technology. Not good stealth technology. More like the Emperor has no clothes technology, which is ironic since their whole courtiers response that they used to go around talking about a few years ago was based on this analogy. Where they just convince their enemy that they are not what they are by simply telling them that they are not what they are. It's obvious that when you debate a modern atheist, that you're not debating someone who merely lacks belief in a God due to insufficient evidence and who would change their mind if you give them evidence, but who will listen to your argument for God's existence and then simply honestly point out logical fallacies. Most of the time, they don't listen to you at all and just assume that you're making an argument that is popular for them to tear down. I remember back when the secularist movement really attacked William Lane Craig, and they just assumed all theists loved William Lane Craig and that he was basically adored by all Christians, and every single Christian was using the Kalam cosmological argument. And they knew how to debunk the Kalam cosmological argument because they heard other atheists tell them how to. And they would all repeat the same debunking. And of course, the way they debunked the Kalam cosmological arguments didn't debunk the actual Kalam cosmological argument. They got the argument wrong, just like they get any version of the first cause argument wrong, just like they get every single argument from design wrong, just like they can't understand the argument from motion and think it's the same thing as the argument from first cause, just like they don't understand the argument from morality or the argument from aesthetics. They actually think the argument from beauty is, or the argument from aesthetics is, beautiful things exist, therefore God exists, and all they have to do is mock and ridicule it. And I agree. If someone actually made the argument that because beautiful things exist, God must exist, there's no reason to refute that. That is a logical fallacy because what is and is not beautiful is subjective. The problem is that the argument from aesthetics is not saying that because beautiful things exist, God exists. The argument from aesthetics is actually about how we don't need a sense of beauty to simply exist and survive. And that the idea that some things are beautiful and other things are not, even if we don't agree on what is and is not beautiful, speaks to a higher reality, is something that eludes them. They just don't grasp this concept because they won't listen to anyone that's outside of their atheist echo chambers. That's the whole point that's being made. The modern secularist movement relies heavily on slogans, and you keep hearing repeatedly the same things over and over and over again, the same examples of the same Bible verses, and it's obvious that they don't really know what these Bible verses mean. For example, I was recently on the, to be fair, fading in popularity, debunking Christianity blog. And they are content with repeating the same old gibberish. At the top, which represents the newest post, we have the Hitler was a Christian post. But you have these other posts there too, and one of them by David Madison, who seems, along with John Loftus, to be the only two people who really maintain this blog with any regularity, and it repeated the same old gibberish you had heard before several times, and none of the arguments it made were particularly valid, including the article of it, "The best cure for Christianity is reading the Bible, essay number 5. And it's obvious he's not really reading the Bible and he's not presenting what it actually says. For example, he talks about Ananias and Sapphira. And the heading for that section would be, "The couple who died because they defied the apostles." And he goes on with the usual rubbish about how, because the book of Acts says they held everything in common that people wouldn't want. That means that they were required to live in a communist commune of some sort, and they were forced to give all their goods to the apostles. And Ananias and Sapphira held back some of the proceeds from the sale of the land, and because they didn't give all of their money to the apostles, they were killed. And that's not what the Bible says. In fact, the text of the Bible clearly states that they didn't even have to sell the land if they didn't want to, that no one made them do that, and that if they sold the land, they were free to keep all the money or to give part of it to the church and keep the rest, or half to the church, whatever they wanted. They were free to do whatever. They were not killed because they defied the apostles, and they were not killed because they refused to give everything to the church. They were killed for lying to God, because they swore to God that they had given all of the money that from the sale of their land to the apostles. And they did this so that they would be praised by the community, that people would say that they were generous, while at the same time holding some of the money back, that they would sell the land and they would keep the proceeds for themselves. This is typical of atheist fare. They will often lie about what the Bible says, and if you point out that they lie, they'll say you're using mental gymnastics to say the Bible doesn't mean what it clearly and plainly says, and will assert that theirs is the plain reading of the text, and the reason you don't agree is because you have cognitive biases that prevent you from seeing the truth, and that you suffer from cognitive dissonance. It's all garbage. What atheists are saying is garbage. But it's garbage we've heard a million times. We've even heard the excuse they make when people point out that they're just repeating arguments. One of the most popular things they'll say is, well, of course we're repeating it. It's like mathematics. It's a limited field. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 4. When you're talking about religion, you have to use the technical language in the examples. It doesn't mean I'm just copying what other atheists say, though. I'm thinking for myself, it's like mathematics. But it's obviously not, because they're clearly lying about what they're saying, and there's no separation between their lie and someone else's lie. And let's face it, they also use exactly the same language, they use the same terminology, they use the same slogans, they use the same examples, they use the same jokes. I'm not going to pretend that if an atheist talks about the flying spaghetti monster and says he's a Pastafarian and says, may his noodly, and says that fake prayer, may his noodly appendages bless you, ramen, that he invented any of that. I'm not going to pretend that the atheist invented a flying spaghetti monster and it's a coincidence that someone else did. I'm not going to pretend it's like mathematics, that in order to discuss religion, you must bring up a flying spaghetti monster. That you must invent a Pastafarian religion to go with your spaghetti monster, and you must have that prayer, may his noodly appendages bless you, ramen. It's clear that this isn't like 2 + 2 = 4. It's obvious you're quoting something. If an atheist tells me he wants to believe as many true things as possible and as few false things, he's quoting Matt Dillahunty. I'm not going to pretend he's not. If an atheist says atheism is a religion like bald as a hair color, he is quoting Sam Harris. And I'm not going to pretend he's not. And that includes if you come up with one of the popular variations of that quote. Because while you're not quoting Sam Harris directly, you're still using a popular retread of his quote. And even then, I know what the retreads will be, because you're still quoting another atheist who is quoting and altering the quote from Sam Harris, like, atheism is a religion like not playing sports is a sport. Atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. Atheism is a religion like abstinence is a sex position. We've heard all this before. We know it's repetitive. And we know that every single atheist in the atheist community is pushing humanist values that came from humanist literature, including the ones who say they are no longer humanists because they value animal life equally to human life. That hasn't changed their actual beliefs, and everything they believe in comes out of the humanist manifestos. And this is important because the social changes we see in the UK and throughout Europe, and even in America, when it comes from the secular left, it all comes from humanist literature. For example, when Canada passed death with dignity, or when Britain passed dignity in dying, if you read the Second Humanist Manifesto, you will see that death with dignity is called a fundamental human right that humanists will stand for. I know we're supposed to pretend that each time a new manifesto is released, the old manifestos are no longer in effect, but they are, because the ideas that went into those manifestos formed the thought that went into all the articles and books and later broadcasts and podcasts and websites that humanists wrote and are still being repeated. If you want to know what the secular left wants out of society, just read humanist literature, and if you want a nice summation of it, read all of the humanist manifestos, not just the latest one, all of them, because that's where they're getting their ideas from. They're getting their ideas from humanist literature. And humanism, secular humanism, is a religion. And secularism in the modern world is exactly the same thing as secular humanism. Secularism is just short for secular humanism. And they're trying to impose their religion on us, and playing silly word games and saying they're not religious. That's all it is. I'll be talking about this topic again, repeating a lot of the same information in case someone didn't hear it. But for now, I shall take my leave of you. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.